Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Don't you want to go to that gospel feast, that promised land where all is peace? Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. When I was 19, I spent the summer as an acting apprentice at the Actors Theater of Louisville. It was a big deal, at least to me, but like most internships, we worked for the experience and not necessarily the paycheck, as there was none. But as I had very little money at the time, whenever we would have our break during the day, whenever it would come and the other apprentices would pop down to the cafe for lunch, I would walk north a couple of blocks to eat my sandwich on the banks of the Ohio River. Now, if you've never stood in that spot, at that particular spot, at where the mighty Ohio is at its widest, just at 1 mile, it's hard to appreciate just how beautiful it actually is. As some will know, the 981-mile river runs from just south of Erie, Pennsylvania, all the way down to Cairo, Illinois, where it joins the mighty Mississippi, faithfully serving as its largest tributary. And while every day I would marvel at its beauty, enjoy the sounds of the steamboat Calliope, and enjoy a moment to myself, if I'm honest, I never really appreciated the view. See, to me, the Ohio was just a river. Sure, it was beautiful, but not all that different from the Missouri River along which I had grown up, or the Genesee along which I would later make my home. But there was something different about the Ohio. Something that either I had never been taught or more likely never bothered to learn. See, the Ohio River, for all of its beauty, also served a dubious purpose of being that dividing line between the North and the South in our country. The natural extension of the Mason-Dixon line as articulated by that ill-conceived and even more ill-considered Missouri Compromise. In other words, for so many years, for so many people, the Ohio River, what was dubbed by many enslaved persons as the Jordan, marked that line between freedom and slavery, that final barrier between life and death, either literal or figurative. It's hard to imagine what it would have been like to stand in that spot, shackled and tortured and raped, knowing that freedom was but a mile away, and yet so far. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. That I could stand on that bank without so much as a fleeting thought for all of those who stood before me, without even a bit of consideration for the blood or sweat or tears that had sprinkled that soil in the years before I stood there, is a sign not only of my ignorance, but of my privilege, my white privilege. See, I live in a world where, because of the color of my skin, I don't really have to think about the color of my skin. Where conversations about race are my choice and not my burden, where if my daughter was in distress and I asked an officer for help. There is almost no scenario where it would end up with her pepper sprayed and shackled in the back of a car. But as we were reminded this week, that is not the case for all. Like so many of you, I'm sure, I watched that body cam video of the little girl being handcuffed and pepper sprayed and forced into the back of a police car in shock and horror. To be clear, I understand the difficult situation in which the officers found themselves and those split-second decisions that had to be made, and yet, at some point when you are forcing a 9-year-old girl into a car, shouting at her, "Stop acting like a child," something has to click in your head that this has gone wrong. Friends, what side of the river are we on? The side of life or the side of death? It's our chance to choose. See, this isn't just one moment out of nowhere. This is a series of moments. It comes after a series of moments. As the great Howard Thurman says, we stand on the shoulder of an infinite series of yesterdays. We stand on the shoulders of an infinite series of yesterdays. Meaning we have to pay attention to all of the experiences that have led us to this point. Friends, look back on them. For 400 years in our country, we have dismissed and brutalized and abandoned black and brown bodies, treated them as something less than human. At first, it was written into our laws, codified into our laws. We had places that we marcated to say beyond which slavery is allowed, beyond which you can treat black bodies this way. But as the years have gone by, it has become less overt and as a result, much more insidious. Perhaps in an effort to put it behind us, in an effort to pretend like we didn't cause any of this pain, too many people who have looked like me have somehow convinced ourselves that we've already crossed that deep river despite never having bothered to build a bridge. We've convinced ourselves that because slavery is illegal outside of our criminal justice system, that because segregation has been struck down outside of our lived experience, that because racism is not something we profess outside of a sad few, that we don't have to deal with issues of race. I can hear it now. Stephen, can't we just talk about something else? No. Not if this matters to us. Not if we really do mean what we say in our prayers and in our hymns. Not if we mean what we say in baptism and in confirmation. Not if we want to be disciples of Jesus Christ. If we don't, then sure, we can talk about whatever else we want. But so long as we want to be people of faith, we cannot ignore the suffering of others. And make no mistake, friends, people are suffering. As we were reminded this week, it doesn't go away if we just bury our heads in the sand. At some point, if we want to get to that gospel feast, that promised land where all is peace, then we are going to have to find a way across that deep river. And we better go together, lest we be swept away. In this Black History Month, our hope has been to focus on a different spiritual each week. I will take the first 2 weeks, and the Reverend Nelson will take the second 2 weeks. Our hope is not so much to learn about these spirituals, though there will be some of that along the way naturally, but rather to learn from them. from those songs written in the midst of pain, and yet baptized into hope. There is much to learn from these spirituals. Things that we might afford to teach ourselves, to teach each other, to learn from them. After all, these were written by a people who had their backs against the wall. We who stand for a moment totally overwhelmed by everything that is facing us, totally overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problems in front of us, just might listen to what these spirituals had to say about what it means to find life in the midst of death. As a good friend put it this week, the spiritual reaches down deep into the soul and cries out to that which can't be described. In other words, friends, our hope is to hear from those whose voices can still be heard, even if their stories cannot. That is, if we're willing to listen. See, for me, the very fact that these spirituals exist at all is itself proof of God. That a people who had been so systematically tortured and abused, taken from their homes, could still somehow manage not only to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ despite the perfidy of the preachers who presented it, but could manage to share the hope of it, not just with each other, but with generations to come, is itself a testament to God's grace. And it could have gone another way. Reading Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, the definitive history of racism in America, as a person of faith, is an exercise in humility. A shameful reminder that too often it has been Christians who have caused these challenges. That too often the church has stood on the wrong side of the river of justice with almost no interest in finding our way across. In other words, yes, these enslaved persons may have learned biblical literacy in a slightly strange way, not being able to actually have the books themselves, but they never wavered from the truth once they found it. They found the truth, held on tight, and shared it with generations to come, and we are better because of it. They understood the gospel better than many of us do, certainly better than the people who taught it to them. And because they shared it, we have something to share with each other in a time of pain. But it could have gone another way. When Howard Thurman, the grandson of enslaved persons, met Mahatma Gandhi in the Khyber Pass in the 1930s, the first question Gandhi asked him was, "Why are you here?" Thurman responded that he was a part of a missionary group in India, at which point Gandhi interrupted him and said, "No, why are you here?" After all, it was Christians who stole your people. It was Christians who forced you into shackles. And it was Christians who put you on a boat, some literally named Jesus. Why are you here? The conversation lasted over 5 hours. And upon his return, in part in response, Thurman wrote what I consider to be the greatest book ever written, period, about what it means to be a person of faith. Jesus and the Disinherited. in which he speaks about a people who stand for a moment with their backs against the wall. And what it means to purge pity and fear and hate instead choose, despite all circumstance, to embrace love. To share love, even when no one shares it with you. See, what these spirituals understood, what had been passed down to Thurman, was the truth of the gospel, the very center of our faith, the promise that God is the God of all. It's something that we're still struggling to really grasp, isn't it? That God is a God of all, not for some, but for all. See, the spirituals began with the understanding that each of us are children of the same God, young and old, black and white, gay and straight, male and female, rich and poor, broken and whole, Republican and Democrat, and everyone beyond and between. We are each of us children of the same God, which among many other things means that we matter. Each of us matters. You matter. Maybe there's someone out there that needs to hear that today. You matter. That I matter. That we matter. That is at the core of our faith. We can hear it in the scripture lesson for today. It comes from Isaiah, and those who completed the Bicentennial Bible Challenge could probably attest. It comes from 2nd Isaiah, that is, the part that was written in captivity when the Israelites had been stolen from their homes and forced into shackles in Babylon. They had been stolen from their homes, forced into shackles in Babylon, and yet still remembered that they were God's. Do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I know you by name, and I am with you. As you go through the water, I will be with you. As you go through the river, they will not overwhelm you. The Israelites understood that God was with them. That even when it didn't seem like they mattered to anyone else, they mattered to God, and because of that, they just plain mattered. What if, friends, we started there, that each and every one of us matters? Of course, we're going to have to get over ourselves in order to fully embrace it. How many of us have heard Black Lives Matter and just out of a knee-jerk reaction, out of a defensive response said all lives matter, to which we ought to respond, yeah, that's the point. Friends, to say Black Lives Matter doesn't mean that other lives don't. It means that after 400 years of systemic torture, rape, and oppression, in which black and brown bodies have been commodified, used, and dismissed, including and up to this very week, we could use the reminder. Friends, we too sit in a city that is divided by a river, and while there is injustice on both sides, it is time for us to figure out what it will take for us to cross over into campground. What will it take for us to overcome the segregation, the separation, and the silly pettiness that keeps us from loving our neighbor as ourselves? What if it starts with what these spirituals were trying to teach us, with the notion that each of us we are each children of the same God? What if that became the foundation on which we built our bridge? Because while it's true that we stand on the shoulders of an infinite series of yesterdays, the good news is that by the grace of God in front of us, there are no limits to tomorrow. There are no limits of the tomorrows ahead, and while each of us might not face all of them, we won't. How we choose to live today, the choices that we make in this moment in response to the pain of the moment, just might make the difference for those who come after. It just might help build that bridge across that deep river into that gospel feast, that promised land where all is peace. And while those who came after us may not remember our name or our story, if we use it, they just might hear our voice. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Don't you want to go to that gospel feast, that promised land where all is peace? Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Amen.